I feel like most solution architects today come from the side of like, I know how machines operate, like zeros and ones and databases, and I can speak to a machine. Whereas I feel like a lot of the good solution architecture, the best operators come from the people and like the human systems side of it.
Welcome to Secret Ops, the podcast uncovering the world of operations one episode at a time. I'm your host, Ariana Cofone, and today's guest is John Forbes Scrugham, interdisciplinary design technologist who's currently a principal solutions architect at Coda. Now, the role of solutions architect has changed a lot over the last couple of years, especially as more no-code or low-code platforms have gotten into the market. So we discussed with John, first of all, what does a solutions architect do? And secondly, how can that approach change how we work? Now, this conversation came out of a chat you and I were having about what we do and how operations and solutions architects are similar but different. Can you break down what traditional solutions architecture has looked like and what solutions architecture means in today's working world?
Yeah, totally. Let's do it. So solution architects, they build, solutions as implied in the name. Basically, software systems, usually for enterprises or businesses. Typically, what you do is you'll focus on both the business and the user. So business meaning like the operations, the value, the different systems, the people, like the integrations that side of the house, as well as the users who use the software application. So it always starts there with the user figuring out like what her needs are, the flows, and like architecting or building that side of the house. And then usually what you do is you translate those needs into building software applications, whether it's like databases on the back end or integrations through APIs or the actual like user interface and some of the screens and the click paths, and then marrying up that like business value with user value.
I find that all the solutions architects that I talk to are quite similar to operators. First of all, they are operators in their own right, but I think they also are people that have a lot of different skill sets that they apply in a more holistic capacity. So like design, technology, communication with clients or users. It seems like these folks are coming in from a lot of different angles to be able to bring those things to life. So when we're talking about what solutions architecture started as, we're talking about like big tech companies and how they structured those roles. So can you talk about what we should be reframing solution architecture as?
Yeah. If you were to go to like Amazon Web Services or Stripe or look at a lot of the job descriptions or even YouTube videos of people who are like, this is how you get into solution architecture and get certified, et cetera, like almost all of it is engineering. It's like, do you know how to use Python? Do you know what an API is? And can you actually like construct these systems? It's essentially coding. And I've been lucky where I've been able to operate at places like Coda, where it's no code and low code. So I like understand the fundamentals and understanding like the business logic on top of the platforms, but then working really closely with like the people and the operators and like how things actually like move through the process. And I feel like as technology has evolved and become more human centric, like the skill stack just kind of goes further and further up the stack to the point where it's like, are engineers actually the best discipline to be solution architects, or are we looking for people who like deeply understand the user and the business problems and come in from that perspective into no code, low code, or even like using AI to prototype the first iterations of things?
What does this look like in real time? Solutions architecture through this more modern day view.
Maybe this is the right time to share some of the phases or versions that I've done solution architecture work at Coda. So essentially, anytime I'm creating a new system, I always start with the people. And so there's usually two types of people when working. So typically there's the end users who are the people who are like using the system, clicking it, entering in data. And then there's usually some sort of like combination of management and process ownership. So almost always there's an executive sponsor, kind of the person signing off on the process and the cost and the business needs. And then on the flip side, basically the partnership, there's almost always like a right-hand person. So whether that's product ops or a program manager or chief of staff, there's always someone who's like owning the solution. And so that trifecta of like the end user, looking for a champion or someone who's like very excited to
Yes.
build the thing with me, an operator who like really drives and owns the designing of that process, and then usually some sort of executive stakeholder. That's the combination of who I end up working with when I think about my end users.
There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen there that you're trying
There
to
are.
work with.
Yeah. And a lot of that pre-sales is just trust building. Like you have people
Mm.
opening up the door to their business and they're sharing things. And there's a combination of they want to improve, or at least there's a group that wants to improve. And then there's a group that's like, you're automating my job, you're making it easier or harder. There's like a lot of emotions that come along with this. And so getting statements of truth and of like what the actual needs are and figuring out like how to pave a path forward is extremely difficult, especially like the larger the business gets.
So those initial discovery conversations, let's call them, how do you build trust and what are you trying to understand in that discovery phase?
It's really like any relationship, like active listening, open-ended questions, like deep empathy. And the more you work with a certain type of business or client, the more you can be like, oh yeah, I've heard this, or that's super common. You're not alone. Like people want to hear that. And it oftentimes is true when, like, for example, with Pinterest, when we had started working with them, we'd worked with like 100 product teams beforehand. So you're coming to the table being like, you're trying to move from a Google Sheet running OKRs for 1,000-person company. Like we've actually heard that the scaling challenge is like super common. The crazy app scripts that you've written, like we know what's going on. And then usually people share more and more, both the artifacts as well as their like wishes and pains around the current system. What happens off the back end of that, it depends like what practice that you come from. So you can either call them user stories or jobs to be done or just like statements of like user flows. But essentially what you do is you translate like as this sort of person, a product manager, VP, product ops, I'm trying to do XYZ. And if like the lower you go, so let's say it's like the user level, it's usually like, I'm trying to get something done. Like I need to get the email out. I need to win the client. I need to ship the product. And then there's almost always like a VP or executive layer of like, I'm trying to get some sort of insight or report within the business. And then the operation level is always like, I need control. I need to be able to architect this. I need to be able to administer it. I need to be able to make and shift things. And so you essentially take all these statements and you stack rank them. And depending on how you work with them, you go from priority zero and you burn down and you just kind of like work through all the user stories until there's some sort of minimum viable product that you can start rolling out with a very small group and go V1, V2, V3.
The prototyping MVP phase, so like minimum viable product. So this essentially like the minimum that you can give to people to start to get feedback on. That process I have found to be very interesting in my own work. I'm very curious how it goes with you because you're dealing with such large teams.
Yeah. Well, going back to the Pinterest example, we're building OKRs or objectives and key results for the product design and engineering team. And so it was already scoped to not be the entire company. Oftentimes we'll prototype with a much smaller group, try to get a champion of basically like friendlies when we're rolling it out and iterating before we do a full rollout. Because once you roll it out, in our case, it was like 550 people, you see on the trainings, and there's like all the objections that are coming through as you're rolling out the training. And so a lot of those people, like they need a V1 before you roll out to the entire, like you need to test it with the group, make sure all the frictions are gone and the things can actually be done before rolling it out to a broader group.
How do you at that point get people on the same page? Do you do a tracker where you have people write down their thoughts? Like, how do you gain trust from that next layer of users?
Yeah, good question. So there's two ways to go about it. The first is just like the infrastructure of it. So normally when you're going through building process, you have this like body of stuff that you just know that needs to be done. And when people call it out, you're like, yeah, I know.
It's on the list. It's on the list.
Yeah, it's on the list. We chose not to include it. And then you essentially design interfaces. So we create a user feedback tracker. People can put in the feedback, and that's like a live, basically burn down of like what the needs are. So they have insight into basically the user facing roadmap. And so that always helps because essentially you need people to voice their concerns and know that they're heard and then see some sort of movement. on the back end of it. The other side of it is kind of the backdoor, like change management personality thing is you work with the champions to basically back channel with the detractors and really understand what the objections are. Is it like, are you scared about losing your job? Is it like you're like used to a certain thing and you're just resisting the change because of uncertainty? That there's always like a deeper objection on the back end. And so we try to work through the detractors on that side because you can build whatever you want and they're always going to be like, no, not interested, or I hate it, or whatnot. Like the change itself is actually the problem, not the software you're building.
Once you prototype, you're rolling this puppy out, you're stabilizing, you're getting people involved, and you're building that like operating system from this prototyped system.
Yeah.
What goes into that scaling portion of the process?
So a few things, like going back to the Pinterest rollout. Well, something weird happened the week that we were rolling it out. So it was just contained to product design and engineering. The CEO had found out about Coda and had got quite excited. And so that same week we were rolling out, had moved the entire 2021 strategy of Pinterest from a Google Doc into a Coda doc, invited the entire company to it, and things just blew up. Like in both good and bad, right? Like they instantly become our fourth largest client. Like 1,000 people come in during that 1 week, and they're totally outside of the context. So of course they have opinions that we haven't captured in the rollout, and IT comes in. And so we've talked a ton about like the actual department, like line of business, but we haven't talked much about like the IT department. And technically, or at least traditionally, they are like the owners of the system, but I feel like with a lot of these like bring your own tools and some of these like gray area in between where department buys or the user buys and then gets up leveled, like IT is in InfoSec like aren't in the conversation. So we got totally blindsided and had to like basically go back to the discovery process with IT as we were rolling out the OKR solution, as everyone was coming in from Pinterest into the same week. It was absolutely wild.
Oh my goodness. Because also IT's like what they're thinking about is quite granular, right? Whereas if we talk about OKRs, it is detailed, but in a different lens. It's connecting strategy with implementation and action. But IT is like, we need to track this. We need to have records of this. We need to be able to have a digital trail for everything that we're doing. So that's a whole different angle of looking at that rollout. How long would you say it took to do that second discovery phase with the IT team once you started rolling it out, the OKRs with the product and other side of the team?
Normally, it should be as long as the discovery for the user side of the house. So as long as the sales cycle takes, in our case, kind of like 2 to 3 months. And so you're going through like encryption at rest. Where does your data get stored? Well, it's AWS. Well, what servers? If it's a European client, it needs to be local. Like all of those sort of conversations. Just had to happen within like a 2-week period because they essentially threatened shutting down the entire thing as we were rolling it out. And so, yeah, it was just crash course. Every conversation that needed to be had basically was had.
I'm literally sweating right now.
It was the most I've sweat. Yeah, absolutely the most I've sweat. Like daily Zoom calls, hundreds of emails back and forth. But typically you align the IT purchasing decision with procurement, with legal, with like the user side of the house, and then you roll it out. So you're asking about like V2 or essentially like how the rollout actually looks. Essentially, in this case, we staffed 2 solution architects to it. I was in kind of a hybrid role. And so you do whatever you need to do for like story points or estimates and figure out your bandwidth. So we were burning down maybe like 10 issues or stories or whatever you want to call the things a week and doing like little tweaks here and there. And so you're looking at like changing the button color, or maybe one team needs a report. So you're building that out, but it's almost always like iteration. You're rarely ever adding like big, meaty, chunky features. And then we waited a whole year for version 2 to roll out. So when there's downtime during a planning cycle, and usually when there's downtime during any system, that's usually when you want to like come back and do like a full revision and do all the things that you wish you did in the first time.
That's such a good point, is you need time to let it marinate with systems and processes and new tools. The initial shock needs to settle into a normality and people need time to get used to it. I find that the next iteration much more satisfying because then then you're deepening. Like typically some of my clients, depends on their level of interest in creating a solution. But typically at first they're like, what we have to figure out how we're structuring the data. Oh, we can like create relational databases that talk to, okay, all right. So how do I, okay, right. So the first phase is like, okay, you can do these things. The second time, it's like, okay, I know we can do these things and I want to automate this and integrate this. And I want to be able to, sleep and have an email be sent about this summary. Like then you've got like all of a sudden all these creative solutions that are fabulous, but also incredibly technically challenging. I find the second one more technically challenging because
Yeah.
then everybody wants to
Yeah.
soup it up. They want to like make it like the Wizard of Oz, I guess, of a system that does everything, including like burps itself.
That tension of scope creep and simplicity in version number 2 is so challenging. In Pinterest's case, the second iteration was like dead simple. We had rolled out a
Really?
system that was too complex in the first iteration. And so what we did is we simplified like the user interface just to be one page. We did a ton of automations off the back end for like reports and clarity, but that thing was like 3 pages, 3 screens in the second iteration. The first one was like infinitely nested. Every team and every division had their own cut and their own views, and it was just like too overwhelming.
You know what I will say though? That's typically what that first version is. What they've done is they say, I'm used to doing this in Google Sheets. I want you to create this exact same thing in Coda. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, you don't, but you don't know that yet. So what I have to do is I have to actually mimic it because you're not going to understand why until you start using it. And this gets to what you, I think, have coined as the I build solutions continuum. Can you explain the continuum? Because I believe everybody is somewhere in between this continuum of building solutions. And a lot of people wouldn't
Yeah.
consider themselves a solution architect, but actually might be. So can you walk through those like personas and how they transition from one to the next?
Yeah, totally. And this goes back to our earlier conversation of like, where do solution architects come from? And so if you were to look on a continuum of people who are like traditionally allowed or can build software applications, you start on the right hand side with like real developers. And when I say real, I mean they can write code and they can communicate with computers, like whatever level, if it's JavaScript, all the way down to machine language. And they can basically like spin up the system. So oftentimes a developer needs to partner with some sort of like front end developer or UX designer to make the system work. We're seeing more full stack exist on that side. So sometimes just a single person, whatever you want to call them, can spin up a system. And most software building tools have been advertised and have been like built for this crowd. Then you have this middle crew, and we can call them citizen developers or barefoot developers, makers, designers of process. It's like this wide and weird group. The titles and the roles, at least in business, oftentimes are like that technical program manager or chief of staff, or even some like PMs, project or product managers, can exist in this space where it's like, I know just enough design and code to get myself in trouble. I will partner with a real developer, or I'll use no and low code or AI to at least prototype some of the solutions before I bring it to development team and build solutions. And then, so if you're looking at magnitude of size, you get like 1% for the real developers in the world or in the knowledge worker world. Maybe you have like 2 or 3% in this like middle weird area, whatever you want to call them, citizen developers. And then you have the end users, the knowledge workers. And this is like the majority of people who do not build software applications and really oftentimes have no say into the software application, except in the case of like partnering with a solution architect or going through some of that discovery that we're talking about before, where we document their needs and their user stories, and they're like, okay, this is what needs to happen. Yes, it looks good. No, it doesn't. But they really don't have their hands on the software. They're not allowed to build the software. And when I first joined Coda, we were like, everyone's a maker. Everyone can build software. That's essentially what we're implying. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the real developer software tools to build tools for that middle group and even like that end user group so that anyone can build software for their own problems. And we were sort of right and sort of wrong. The right part was, yes, we built the tools. That 2% group was really excited. But if you go to the most, like the largest group over here, I think we got it wrong. We were building like databases and automations and buttons and things that like you need to basically be a UX designer or developer, or at least be adjacent to understand how to use it. And we just like weren't getting that group right. So a lot of what I was doing kind of in my mid time at Coda, like 3 years in, was creating some of the patterns that we found at like Pinterest with OKRs and Coinbase with how do we launch products, and templatize those, basically create boilerplates that they can then copy into their own like workspace, iterate on, and essentially like giving them the power to be able to build their own tools.
That for me, so oh my gosh, I have so much to say, and I'm going to try and be concise with it. I went into technology in the traditional sense. I'm going into web development, learn full stack web development, JavaScript, right? That was my world. When I graduated and I was looking for a job, I ended up getting into technology education, and I would fly around the world and I would teach about emerging technologies. And the main reason why we were hired to come and teach is because there was such a disconnect between the traditional technologists, the developers, and the everyone else, that there was not that communication happening. So you would have a lot of these big organizations that would have these technical products that the people that weren't technical couldn't explain, but they knew that they had to express the value of it. And the technical people really didn't have the language or the muscle to be able to communicate that. That gap was wide. It was really wide back in the day. What I've seen in the last 5 years is that gap is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think it's a couple of things. First of all, just having no code or low code tools that are a step up above what people are used to. Like people are used to Excel, people are used to Google Sheets. Having that leap into Coda, that is like a perfect little baby step for people to get a little bit more technical. So that's a big, I think, tool that people are able to see now and feel and touch and solve their own problems. Then in the last year, seeing AI, when I'm working with clients, I'm like, I'm trying to figure out how to write this formula. And they're like, oh, let's just type it into AI. And I don't think, because I have the technical skills, I don't even think of that, right? I think I need to solve it from my brain.
Yeah.
I could go on a whole rant on this because I've seen it so intimately. But if technologists could get better at translating what they do, if end users could be more flexible to change, and if we just get more and more of those middle translators, I think we'll be able to ride the waves of change pretty decently. I don't know. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your thoughts?
I think the word translation is like absolutely right. Like if you look at the 1980s world, you have end users who are like, we have this business process, and you have super technical people being like, bits and pieces, this is how to get it on the mainframe. And there's like this really wide like language issue. And so you have the emergence of domain driven design and some practical applications where it's like, don't write computer code using computer terms, put it within the language of the domain or the business that you're working with. Like let's make the code closer to what the language that they're actually using. If you look at what's today with like AI, you have people able to articulate their needs in English or whatever language they speak. And then you have the machines being like, oh, this is what you mean. Let me spit back a prototype. And you can kind of have that conversation back and forth using the interface of language. And so it's not like drag and drop interface, like no code. It's language. It's not bits and pixels and that sort of thing that the real developers can speak. It's like using that language that they're using within business. And I think that's incredibly powerful. You look at how it's implemented now, and with Claude or Artifact, it's like you can toggle between the front end and back end. I think there needs to be a middle layer where it's like, oh, I'm actually trying to move this around. I don't care about seeing the code, but I think we're getting close.
Yeah, it's a whole skill that I have to relearn. So I also want people who are non-technical to understand that even somebody myself who has been technical in the past, using AI is not something that comes naturally to me. As much as we're using our natural language to ask questions, I have to intentionally say, oh, can I use this to ask this question and solve this problem? I have to relearn myself how to leverage the technology to make my life easier. But it does not come natural to me. We're all going through this journey and it's trippy as hell, but you have to embrace it. You absolutely have to start to embrace it, because if you don't, you're just going to get farther behind faster. But I do want to ask you, if people are listening to you and they're like, oh, I think I'm like John. I think I'm like the glue. I think I've been doing this solutions architecture role and I maybe didn't even know it. Where would you tell people to start if they wanted to intentionally go into that role?
So there's a few places. The first thing that I'm a tinker and like a maker by nature. And so what I tend to do is actually start with the tooling and then move into more of the abstract like principles side of the house. And so if you're looking at tooling, start with the no code and low codes. So Coda being that like happy medium, Notion being the lightweight version, Airtable being more at its core a relational database. So that side of the house is a totally great place to start. The other side of the house is start with AI. So both ChatGPT and Anthropic's Claude can do prototyping with natural language. Vercel's V0 is actually designed to do prototyping. Like that's the application. Played around with that. You can write with natural language, have applications spit out. You can look on the back end, inspect the code, and you can kind of understand the play between what you're asking it and what it's spitting back. Um, so that's like the tooling side of the house. Like I would absolutely start there. Almost all of them have galleries and have examples that you can play around and tinker with.
Can I jump in on that tooling really quick? I would say look into the tooling and pick a small thing that's a pain in your butt on a day to day basis and try and solve it with
Ooh,
that tooling.
yes.
Find the thing that would motivate you to solve it. And it will push past the sort of, oh, dang, I'm learning something new. Because ultimately, the goal is that you find a solution on the other end to make your life better. So that was like, that's my added pro tip to that.
Piggyback off of that. You said new tools, or you can pick an old tool. Go with Google Sheets or go with Excel. They have huge communities, and people in the space often say those are like the OG no and low code tools. They're like ubiquitous. There's a ton of like even like Stack Overflows around like how to do certain things with it, and all of them have a lightweight formula language. So start there. The other side of the house would be like the principles side of the house. So if you're getting into like UX design, I happen to take a general assembly course. I think a lot of those like kind of 8-weeky boot camps, you can get your hands dirty with designing in there, like with Figma or doing card sorting or user stories or kind of the whole process of how do you take user needs and implement it into software.
Okay, John, I hate to wrap up, but I want to learn a little bit about you as a human. So I'm going to wrap up with some rapid fire questions.
Sounds good.
First one is, what is your favorite part of the day?
Oh, I'm a night owl. So when everyone goes to sleep, baby's down, the dogs have like settled into the bed, and I can either like read or do yoga or just kind of like roam around the house and make a midnight snack. Like that's the ideal part of the night.
What is the best purchase you have made under $50?
This might be cliche. My wife's in the back; she's going to crack up. I love the book The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. And so I downloaded it on Audible. It's $15. I listened to it 3 times and bought the book. So technically, the combination of those is both under $50, and it's been fantastic. Yeah, super quick pitch. Rick Rubin founded Def Jam Records, very creative person, and talks about the creative process, in his case with musicians, but more generally around the self-doubt and the hurdles and inspiration and like how to actually make things. And so a lot of what I do is like making software, being creative within that space. And I've found something like outside of my industry to be incredibly inspiring to like bring into it.
What is a favorite quote that you have?
It's a Teddy Roosevelt, and it's like basically be in the arena. Like the people who are in the arena doing the things on the ground in the weeds are the people who get to have the say. And like you don't ever have to listen to the spectators or the people watching you because they're sitting eating popcorn and they will always have comments on what you're doing, but they're not in there with you.
What is something that makes you little kid happy?
Maybe biased because we're at a beach right now and because I do it with my son, but building sandcastles and digging and making dams and playing with like water and streams and kind of moving it around is incredibly satisfying. Firstly, because it's so easy to set up, and secondly, because it's really easy to destroy, and the tide will always wipe it away. So there's like nothing you can do to stop it, and it doesn't matter. It's all refreshed the next day.
Last question is, what do you want to be when you grow up?
So in 2nd grade, when I was posed this question, I wrote 2. So one was being an architect, and I met physical architect because I didn't really know about computers at the time, or I guess we didn't even have a computer. So I think I'm getting close on the digital side of the house. And the second thing, one long word, it was Grand European Tour Man. My dad started a business called Grand European Tours. He's sold tours throughout Europe. They're like packaged. And I wanted to be, the man as part of it. Oh
Oh
my
my
gosh. And
God.
Kelsey's like, ballerino. Yes, I did want to be a ballerina.
Oh my God, I love it. That's so, I also wanted to be a ballerina. I think they're amazing. John, you're so fantastic. If people are listening and they want to learn more about what you are doing and what you're up to, where can we point them?
My new website, johnforbes.net, and that will be portfolio, blog, and other stuff about me.
Amazing. We'll put that in the description. John, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and just your generosity. Secret Ops listeners, thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe, let your friends know about the podcast, and also check us out on YouTube, and we will see you next time. Bye.